right. So today, we're diving deep into a case that's got it all. Gang activity, legal strategy, and some seriously high stakes.
Oh, yeah. This one's fascinating.
We're looking at Clarence Heatley and John Cuff. And for our listeners who haven't heard of them, they were both part of the Preacher crew.
Yeah, a pretty notorious gang. They were involved in a lot of criminal activity. I mean, we're talking murder, robbery, extortion, drug trafficking, the whole 9 yards.
And Heatley, who also went by the alias Preacher, was the leader.
That's right. And get this. Between Heatley, Cuff, and 10 other members of the gang, they were hit with a whopping 86 counts.
86. Wow.
That gives you an idea of the scale of their operation.
Yeah.
The government was definitely not messing around.
Yeah, I mean, especially when you consider that both Heatley and Cuff were facing the death penalty.
Exactly. The government had filed notices of intent to seek the death penalty against both of them.
So that brings us to the big question. Knowing that they were potentially facing execution, why would they take plea deals?
Well, you have to imagine the kind of pressure they were under.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, facing the possibility of execution, it's a lot to process.
Yeah.
And their lawyers probably advised them that a plea deal was their best shot at avoiding that outcome.
Yeah, a classic risk-reward situation.
Exactly.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Part of their plea deal involved waiving their right to appeal.
Yeah. They essentially traded the chance of ever being free for the certainty of avoiding the death penalty.
Which brings up a whole host of ethical questions, right? I mean, what happens if new evidence emerges later on? Or if someone is pressured into taking a plea deal, even if they're innocent?
Absolutely. It really makes you think about the balance between efficiency in the legal system and making sure individual rights are protected.
No easy answers there.
Nope. But let's get back to Heatley and Cuff. Because even though they took those plea deals, they later tried to challenge their convictions.
They did.
Yep. Heatley argued he had ineffective assistance of counsel, meaning he felt his lawyers didn't do a good job representing him. He also brought up some procedural issues with the case. Cuff went even further.
Oh.
Yeah. He claimed ineffective assistance of counsel too, but he also argued that some of the charges against him didn't involve interstate commerce, so the federal court shouldn't have had jurisdiction.
Oh, wow.
And then on top of that, he threw in accusations of prosecutorial misconduct and selective prosecution, like he was pulling out all the stops.
Sounds like he was trying everything he could think of.
He was. But before we get into how the court responded to all of that, let's talk about what they actually pleaded guilty to.
Okay, yeah. What were the specifics?
Well, Heatley admitted to participating in 13 murders and 1 attempted murder.
13 murders.
Yeah. And during his plea allocution, which is basically a formal statement in court where you admit your guilt, he gave some pretty chilling details, like how he ordered hits on people, engaged in robberies, extortion, even arson.
That's a lot to take in. And what about Cuff? What did he plead guilty to?
He confessed to his role in 11 murders, all carried out on behalf of the Preacher crew.
Wow. It's clear these weren't just small-time offenses.
Absolutely not. This was serious, organized crime, and their confessions really painted a picture of how brutal the Preacher crew's operations actually were.
So we've got these two guys, both admitting to horrific crimes to avoid the death penalty, and then they turn around and try to get their convictions overturned. What did the court think about all this?
Well, before we get to the court's decision, there's this really fascinating legal concept that comes into play here, the dual sovereignty principle. And this is where things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
All right, so the dual sovereignty principle. So the dual sovereignty principle, it basically means that both the state and federal governments can prosecute someone for the same conduct without it being considered double jeopardy.
Hold on, so you're saying someone could be tried and convicted in state court,
Yeah.
and then the feds could turn around and try them again for the same exact thing. I don't get it. How's that not double jeopardy?
Yeah, it seems kind of counterintuitive. But the key is that state and federal governments, they're seen as separate sovereign entities, right? Each with their own set of laws. It's kind of like two different referees calling fouls in the same game.
Okay, so they each have their own area they control.
Exactly.
But then doesn't that mean someone could essentially get punished twice for the same crime?
Yeah, it's a valid concern for sure. There's actually this famous Supreme Court case, United States versus Lanza, where a guy was convicted in both state and federal court for the same act. He was selling illegal liquor.
Yeah.
And the Supreme Court, they upheld it. They basically said, look, state and federal governments often have different interests that they're trying to protect.
So thinking about the Preacher crew, could Heatley and Cuff Could they have faced separate charges in state court for those murders, even after being convicted in federal court?
Oh, absolutely. See, the federal government was focused on racketeering and other federal offenses, but the state, they could have gone after them for murder under their own laws.
So they really could have been tried twice for the same killings.
Yeah. It gets complicated.
Definitely. But there has to be some limit to this dual sovereignty thing, right? What if it's obvious that one government is just trying to tack on extra charges after the other one already went after them?
You're right. There is an exception. It's called the sham and cover exception. Basically, if one sovereign is just acting as a puppet for the other, just trying to skirt around double jeopardy, then that second prosecution might get thrown out.
So, like, if the feds were pulling the strings to get a state prosecutor to go after someone they'd already convicted, that wouldn't fly.
Exactly. The court's been pretty clear that that kind of collusion, trying to sneak in a second prosecution that's basically just a do-over of the first one, it's not allowed.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But I bet it's pretty hard to prove that kind of like behind-the-scenes stuff.
Yeah, you're not wrong. It's a high bar to clear, this sham and cover exception. The courts want to see solid evidence of bad faith, real collusion between the governments.
Did Heatley try to use this sham and cover argument in his case?
He didn't. And from the information we have, there's no indication that there was any prior state prosecution for these crimes, let alone any hint of collusion.
Okay, so back to Heatley and Cuff trying to overturn their convictions. What did the court ultimately decide?
They denied both of their petitions.
Denied? Why?
A couple of key points. First, they pointed out that Heatley's own statements during his plea allocution, remember, where he admitted guilt, those statements directly contradicted his later claims that his counsel was ineffective. He clearly admitted guilt and said he understood the charges.
So his own words came back to bite him.
Pretty much. And the court also made a point of saying that both Heatley and Cuff, they specifically waived their right to appeal or file these types of petitions when they signed those plea agreements. They knew what they were giving up.
But what about Cuff's argument about not appealing earlier because of issues with his lawyers? Didn't that give him some grounds to challenge it later?
The court addressed that too. They basically said Cuff hadn't shown a good enough reason for not appealing when he had the opportunity. He dissed his window, and this later petition couldn't change that.
So, tough luck for Cuff.
Basically, they stuck to the idea that plea agreements, they're binding contracts. You can't just try to undo them later on without a very compelling reason, which neither Heatley nor Cuff had.
So in the end, despite trying everything they could, they were stuck with what they had agreed to.
Yeah. Life sentences without parole. And they had used up all their legal options. The court's decision really hammered home the serious nature of those plea bargains and the whole idea of, finality in the legal system.
It's a lot to think about. It shows how tough those choices can be when the stakes are so high.
Yeah.
And it highlights how complex the justice system can be, all those gray areas.
For sure. It's not just a story about a couple of criminals and their punishment. It's a way to look at how our justice system works, how we balance individual rights with making the system run smoothly.
It really makes you think about the bigger picture, right? Like, we see these awful crimes,
Right.
and of course we want justice to be served. But then there's all these, legal procedures, and while I get why they exist, they definitely raise some questions.
Absolutely. It's not just a story about these two guys, Heatley and Cuff. I mean, it makes you think about how the whole justice system works. How do we balance, being fair to everyone and making sure the system functions properly?
Yeah, those plea agreements. They were so important to what happened to these guys. And I get it, from a practical point of view. Imagine if every single person who took a plea deal could later appeal it.
Oh, the courts would be completely swamped.
Totally. So plea bargains are like a tool, right?
Yeah, they help manage all the cases. But as we talked about, they also have these ethical implications. Like, when you waive your right to appeal in a plea deal, you're giving up something pretty fundamental, legally speaking.
It's like you're losing a safety net. And what really gets me is the potential for coercion. Think about being Heatley and Cuff, facing execution, under pressure, maybe scared for their lives, even in prison. Did they really choose that plea deal? Or did they feel like they had no other option?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's hard to know what was going on in their minds, but there's definitely a power dynamic there, right, when you're bargaining with the state. I mean, there are rules to prevent someone from being forced into a plea, but the possibility of pressure, even subtle pressure, it's there.
And then there's the whole dual sovereignty thing. It's fascinating from, a legal standpoint. But it's like, can someone really be punished twice for the same thing? I mean, theoretically, someone could do their time in federal prison and then get hit with another trial and another sentence in state court for the same actions.
Right, and it does feel kind of unfair on the surface, but the courts have said time and time again that this separation between state and federal, it matters. They have different powers and interests. The important thing, like you said before, is to make sure this dual sovereignty idea isn't being used, just to pile on charges or to get revenge.
A lot of nuances there.
Yeah.
This case really shows how complex things can be, all the moving parts.
Yeah.
So what are the big takeaways for our listeners? What should they keep in mind?
I think the biggest one is to be skeptical. It's easy to just take what happens in court as like the final word, but this case really shows how important it is to look deeper, to think about the process, about whether things were fair or not.
To question everything. Basically.
Exactly. This case, it's not just about two guys, it's about how our whole legal system works. And the more we know about how it works, the better we can push for fairness and hold the people in power accountable.
This deep dive has definitely given us a lot to think about. From gang violence to plea bargains to dual sovereignty. Behind every case, there are these human stories, these complicated questions that are worth talking about.
I couldn't agree more. And for everyone listening, I hope this encourages you to learn more about these issues, to ask questions, to have these important conversations about how we can make our legal system fairer for everybody.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a wild ride.
My pleasure.